It's going to get hot, it's going to get depressing, because the topic that I'm going to speak about is not going to be particularly uplifting, but there will be a silver lining at the end of it. So if you just show some patience at the end, hopefully there will be some hope at the end of the tunnel. Here to talk to you about the conflict between Iran and Israel. You can hardly go by a day or at least a week without hearing something about it in the news. It is clearly something that by now has come to define the overarching tensions that exist in the Middle East. And of course, there is a very strong ideological undertone to this conflict. And one of the things that I looked at when I was writing my dissertation was to try to figure out what is truly the root of this conflict. Is it driven by ideological fervor? Or is there a different reality behind this conflict that is perhaps a better explanation as to why we have ended up in the situation that we have? At the end of the day, one of the biggest misconceptions that exists today is the belief that this conflict between Iran and Israel is yet another one of these ancient Middle Eastern conflicts that has been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the history of the Jewish people's interaction with the Iranian people have been overwhelmingly positive for most of history. What we're seeing right now is a rather recent phenomenon. The history of them actually began around 539 BC when Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, liberated the Jewish people from the Babylonian captivity. 1/3 of the Jews that were liberated stayed in what is today's Iraq and are today's Iraqi Jews, most of them living in Israel, having traveled to Israel through Iran and through the help of the Iranian state during the time of the Shah. 1/3 of them went to Iran, which was then the world superpower, and they're today's Iranian Jewish community. Still in Iran, probably around 25,000 men strong, and have contributed a tremendous amount to Iran's political and cultural history. And 1/3 of them went back to what is today's Israel, then historic Palestine, and did the second rebuilding of the temple, funded incidentally by Persian tax money. That's the history, and there's much more, of course, that can be added to that. But what we see today is mostly a conversation as if this is a deeply rooted conflict, rooted in ideological fervor and hatred. Let me start off by giving you a quote from an Israeli prime minister, actually, to show how superficial that picture is. The quote reads as this: "Iran is Israel's best friend, and we do not intend to change our position in relation to Tehran." This is a quote by an Israeli prime minister, but it wasn't Ben-Gurion in the 1960s or Golda Meir in the 1970s. It was actually Yitzhak Rabin. The year was 1987. Ayatollah Khomeini was alive, and he was using a rhetoric that is even more venomous than the rhetoric that Ahmadinejad has been using in the last 8 years. Yet, Rabin referred to Iran as a strategic ally, and this was in an interview and a speech that he gave to IDF Radio, the Israeli Defense Forces radio station. So what's the background to this? Well, when Israel was founded, one of the tenets that was created by Ben-Gurion was called the doctrine of the periphery. The idea that Israel's security would be best achieved by reaching out and creating alliances with the non-Arab states in the periphery of the Middle East in order to balance the Arabs in Israel's vicinity. There were several important periphery powers, Ethiopia, Turkey, but the most important periphery power from the Israeli perspective was Iran, for several different reasons. It was a very powerful state, it had access to energy, it was an exporter of energy, and in many different ways, Iran looked at the region from a similar perspective. Both Iran and Israel faced, from their own perspectives of their regimes, common threats. And those common threats were primarily threats from strong Arab nationalist governments, such as Egypt under Nasser or Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and Soviet penetration of the Middle East. And the Soviets, at the end of the day, were the primary armors of those Arab nationalist states. The perception of common threats pushed Iran and Israel closer together, and a very strong intelligence and security collaboration began between the two. Now, from the Israeli perspective, having managed to break free from its isolation, because at the time Israel was tremendously isolated, was a major point of pride. And they would have loved to be able to showcase that they had created such a strong alliance with a major Muslim power in the Middle East. The Iranians, however, or I should perhaps more specifically say the Shah, because he was the one who almost entirely personally handled this file for the Iranian state, saw it differently. On the one hand, there was a recognition that the alliance with Israel brought the Iranians tremendous benefits, not only the security collaboration in the region, but primarily the belief that the Shah had that he had to have strong relations with Israel in order to be able to get closer to Washington. But the Shah felt that this was a relationship that needed to be kept completely in secret, because if the Shah was publicly moving closer to the Israelis, the fear was that this would cause Arab anger to be directed towards Iran, Arab anger that otherwise would have been directed at Israel itself. So the Iranians went to great lengths, trying to keeping this relationship as secret and behind the scenes as possible. So for instance, Yitzhak Rabin, when he was traveling to Iran in the 1970s as a defense minister, always wore a wig so that no one would be able to recognize him. The protocol that emerged was that the Prime Minister of Israel used to travel to Iran and land always around 2 a.m. in the morning, making sure that no one would notice that she was there. The Foreign Minister of Iran did not even know about the visit until about 3 days later. The Shah met with the Prime Minister completely alone and handled that file completely by himself. There was a special tarmac built in Tehran airport, very, very far away from the main terminal, in order to make sure that no one would notice the daily flights by El Al, the Israeli airline, coming to Tehran. This was, of course, an open secret. Everyone in the region knew about this relationship, but as long as the Shah kept the Israelis at an arm's length publicly, some sort of a strange modus vivendi between Iran and the Arab states still was sustainable. Now, all of this, there's a perception, changes with the 1979 revolution, in which a very radical Islamist faction within the revolutionaries take over the country, start to use a tremendously venomous and ideologically motivated rhetoric against the Israelis. There's a little bit more complexity to this picture. What happens in 1979 is very clear to the Israelis. They knew better than anyone else that if there was a revolution, Iran would likely turn against Israel. Because unlike the United States, for instance, the Israelis had pretty good intelligence of what was going on inside of Iran, because mainly because of the access to the Iranian Jewish community, but also because they were not under the same type of restrictions as American diplomats were in Iran. They knew that if the leftists were to take over Iran, they would be hostile towards Israel because they viewed Israel as a Western imperialist outpost in the region. And if the Islamists were to take over, they too would be hostile towards Israel because of more religious and ideological reasons. So there was no welcoming of this revolution in Israel. But there was also a realization that geostrategic factors trumped everything else. Immediately after the revolution, the Israelis do everything they can to try to retain the relationship with the new Iranian government, even though they knew quite well about the ideological and other factors that would cause this government to be very hostile towards Israel, at least at a public level. They, for instance, instructed when the head of the mission in Israel called the deputy Iranian foreign minister to ask him whether they should close down the ministry, the mission, whether they should close down the offices of El Al in Tehran. The answer was, don't ask, and perhaps you can keep it. But if you ask, you're going to risk getting a yes or a no. It's better that you don't ask at all. And to the very last moment, the Israelis tried to make sure that they could stay there. And there was a reason for this. In only 4 or 5 years earlier, when Ethiopia had a regime change and it switched camps in the Cold War, went from one camp to another, the Israelis still managed to retain a very close security relationship with the new regime in Ethiopia, and they did so for strategic reasons. They needed Ethiopia in order to balance Egypt. In this specific case, they still needed Iran, revolutionary or not, to be able to balance the Iraqis. And this is exactly what they tried to do. And one of the main cards that the Israelis had in order to be able to retain that relationship was to utilize the fact that the entire Iranian military was built on American weaponry. And once the Iranians took the American hostages and President Carter put into place an arms embargo and sanctions against the Iranians, the Iranian military was falling apart because without those spare parts, they couldn't sustain it. There were two countries in the world that had access and willingness to sell to the new Iranian regime spare parts for their military. One was North Vietnam, that happened to have a lot of American spare parts for a very different reason. And one was Israel. And immediately the Israelis began playing that card, trying to retain those relationships with the Iranian military in order to show their strategic utility to even a revolutionary Iranian government. And they made a compelling case, because Iran, paradoxically, was now even more isolated and in need of Israel than it was during the 1970s. Because as a result of the Iranian government's own radicalism, not only had it sustained a very bad relationship with the Soviets, but now it had also turned the other superpower in the world, the United States, into its enemy. And particularly once the Iraq-Iran war started, the Iranians were in great need of the support that they could get from the Israelis. However, whereas the Shah wanted to keep Israel at a distance, occasionally criticized Israel very sharply, but sustained that strong relationship, and it was an open secret that he did so, for the revolutionaries this was even more complex. On the one hand, they needed the Israelis. On the other hand, they had this idea that in order to be able to secure Iran and in order to be able to expand the revolution, the Iranians needed to find a way to bridge the Sunni-Shia gap, to bridge the Persian-Arab divide. And the answer for this that they had, and which they're still trying to play till this day, is the idea of political Islam. By utilizing political Islam, the Iranians were trying to create a new narrative in the region in which Iran could be fully accepted and could even have a leadership role on key regional matters in a way that the Shah had failed and to a large extent even had not tried. Political Islam was essential to them, and political Islam provided them with the anti-Israeli card. Every time there was tensions was flare up between the Arabs and the Iranians, particularly during the Iraq war, the way the Iranians tried to neutralize the support that Saddam Hussein would be able to get from other Arab states as a result of a pan-Arab narrative, the Iranians tried to counter that by Islamizing the Palestinian question. There was actually a meeting between Khomeini and Arafat only 10 days into the revolution. Arafat shows up in Tehran unannounced. And when he comes to the airport, quickly a bunch of folks close to Khomeini rush over to the airport to greet him, and they immediately bring him to meet with Khomeini. They have a 2-hour conversation, and it was very clear. Khomeini really did not like Arafat, and the feeling was quite mutual. Khomeini used the opportunity to lecture Arafat for those 2 hours, essentially explaining to him that Arafat has been a failure because he had pursued an Arab nationalist narrative and cause for the Palestinians. Whereas in reality, this needed to be reframed as a religious issue. Now, Arafat was pretty clever and understood exactly what Khomeini was trying to do. If the Palestinian issue, which is a central issue to the region and continues to be so today, is viewed as an Arab issue, then what is Iran's role in that issue as a non-Arab power? And if Iran seeks to be the leader of the region, as it does under this regime and as it did under the previous regime, how can it be a leader in the region if it is not part, if it doesn't have a clear and obvious role in the most central question of the region? So Khomeini was trying to introduce and reframe this as an Islamic issue in order to pave the way for Iranian leadership. Arafat, who was never particularly religious and was much more secular, resisted, and tensions immediately came through with this. Arafat was also very disappointed because the PLO had invested in many of the Iranian opposition groups in the 1970s, and hoping now that as a result of the revolution, that investment would pay off with the Iranian state providing resources to the Palestinian cause. What he soon were to find out was that the Iranian regime was very eager to provide a lot of rhetorical support for the Palestinians, but not match that with any actual physical resources. In fact, I interviewed an Iranian reformist who had spent a 3-hour conversation with Khomeini trying to figure out what is the Iran Islamic Republic's policy vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue. And to sum up, Khomeini said that the Palestinian issue is primarily a Palestinian issue. Secondarily, it should involve the surrounding Arab states. Only at the third level should it involve Iran, and then only as an ideological and rhetorical force in favor of the Palestinians. Iran, he said, should never become a frontline state against the Israelis. And this was a very strategic decision by the Iranian regime, essentially trying to have its cake and eat it too. Provide the image that they are the true protectors of the Palestinians, but in reality, because of Iran's own strategic concerns, pursue a policy behind the scenes that was completely to the opposite. In fact, it was interesting to see that the more criticism Iran received from the Arab states, particularly from Arafat, for not having provided support for the Palestinians, the more the Iranians increased their rhetorical pressure and more vicious rhetoric against the Israelis. In fact, the Jerusalem Day that the Iranians celebrate till this day, which is the occasion in which 8 years or so ago Ahmadinejad made that statement that was incorrectly translated as "wipe Israel off the map." That was instituted as a result of criticism from the Arabs that the Iranians had not lived up to their promise of truly supporting the Palestinian cause. The Islamic Republic's response to that criticism was institute a parade calling for Jerusalem to be the capital of the Palestinians. Until this day, that is taking place in Iran. Now, this continues throughout the 1980s, in which the Iranians use very heated rhetoric against the Israelis, but behind the scenes, they're continuing to deal with the Israelis for strategic reasons. And of course, everyone here in this room knows this climaxed into the Iran-Contra scandal, an Israeli initiative that was aimed not just to sell arms to the Iranians and support the Iranians against Saddam Hussein, but truly an effort by the Israelis to bring the United States and Iran closer together for strategic reasons. From the Israeli perspective, the obvious point was, if Iraq were to win the war against Iran, then that would mean that Iraq would become the most powerful state in the region, with not only access to its own enormous oil resources, but also access to the Iranian oil resources. And Iraq, with its mighty army, which up until then had never been a full player in any of the Arab wars against Israel, would potentially be able to run over Jordan and put 4 divisions on Israel's vulnerable eastern border. As a result, it was critical from the Israeli perspective to ensure that Iran did not lose that war. But even better, if they could bring the United States and Iran back together, because the United States, as you may remember from seeing the pictures of Donald Rumsfeld shaking Saddam Hussein's hand, was gravitating towards the Iraqi side in that conflict, whereas Israel was gravitating towards the Iranian side. There was a clear divergence between the US and the Israeli position on how to handle Iran. Now this continues throughout the 80s. You have the climax in the Iran-Contra scandal. And then the real change in the relationship between Iran and Israel happens between 1991 and 1993. Because at that point, you have 2 cataclysmic events in the region and globally. First, the Soviet Union collapses. And secondly, Iraq, the last standing army, Arab army that could pose a conventional military threat against both the Iranians and the Israelis, was defeated by the United States and a UN coalition in the 1991 Persian Gulf War. Suddenly, the 2 key factors that had pushed Iran and Israel closer together throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even the 1980s, in spite of Iran's new ideological fervor, was gone. And a new security environment was forming in the Middle East, one in which Iran and Israel began to emerge as 2 of the most powerful states in that region. And it's at this point in which you start hearing in Israel that Iran is starting to emerge as a potential threat against Israel. In late 1991, you start to see the first article in the Jerusalem Post in which the argument essentially is the real threat to Israel is no longer the Arab vicinity, because Israel had completely won that battle. There was not a single Arab army that could pose a conventional threat to Israel. The only threat remaining from the Arab side was a non-conventional, asymmetric threat. But the one state in the region that could was Iran. So now there was no more talk about balancing the Arab vicinity. Now the new threat was the Persian periphery. And all of this really accentuates with the way that the Persian Gulf War itself took place. As you remember, the United States decided to expel Saddam Hussein from his invasion of Kuwait. And it was critical for the United States to make sure that there was a strong Arab coalition within the international coalition. And this was important to really demonstrate that this was not a Western imperialist war against another third world country. This was the international community united against an aggressor. To do so, an Arab component was needed. But to get the Arabs on board, and I'm simplifying a little bit, the Arabs had two simple conditions. The first condition was, in order for the Arabs to help the United States against Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, afterwards, the United States needed to seriously take a look at Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. Secondly, in order for the Arabs to be in the coalition, Israel needed to be out of the coalition. And this is precisely why Saddam Hussein hurled 34 Scud missiles against Israel in the hope that the Israelis would retaliate. And the minute they would retaliate, the Arab coalition would walk out. Much of the international coalition potentially could fall apart. And that's why the Bush administration, the Bush senior administration, succeeded in making sure that Israel did not retaliate, did not use military force, even when Israel itself actually was attacked. And you may see an interesting parallel today in which we're saying that there's no way we can prevent the Israelis from taking military action because Israel is a sovereign state. Well, Israel was a sovereign state in 1991 as well. And the United States succeeded in making sure that the Israelis did not enter the war because it was viewed as such a critical misstep for the United States if they did so. This was a tough decision for Shamir because the entire Israeli doctrine was that if ever attacked by the Arabs, the Israelis should use disproportionate force in order to reinstate its qualitative and strategic edge in the region. Now, there was an attack, Scud missiles, and for the first time the Israelis did not retaliate at all. But both of these developments created a very uneasy situation inside of Israel, in which strategists started to ask themselves, in this post-Cold War world, where is Israel's strategic significance for the United States? When you had a situation in which in the British Parliament, politicians began to talk about Israel not as an asset, but as a burden in the region, because you had to devote so much resources to make sure that Israel did not interfere in the war, in which Israel could not add any resources to the fight, but instead constantly had to be kept out. What truly was Israel's strategic significance to the Israelis going forward? And add to that the very dangerous, from the Israeli perspective, emerging picture of the Iranians starting to reach out to the United States, seeking to have a rapprochement. Khomeini had died. There was a new president in Iran called Rafsanjani who was very eager to reform the economy and he needed Western investment in order to do so. And it was constantly sending out feelers to the United States to try to see if there was a way to amend fences. Where would Israel's significance be? If Israel is gravitating towards the Arab side in the conflict, remember the Madrid conference that paved the way for the Oslo Agreement, that Shamir had to be dragged to. And in addition to that, if then the United States were to make friends with the Israelis. At this point, the Israelis begin making an argument to the United States that it is now ready to make peace with the Palestinians. This was made possible because the Labour government, the Labour Party, won an unprecedented victory in June 1992, and they could form a government without having Likud in the coalition. And the Labour Party realized that the strategic environment was changing. And unless Israel changed, it would be the biggest loser of this change. So they immediately shifted. And they started talking about, how do we make peace with the Palestinians? How do we do what the Americans want us to do, is to go along with this type of a peace agreement? And the argument the Israelis then presented to the US government was, in order for Israel to be able to take that risk for peace, the United States needed to isolate, contain, and sanction Iran in order to make sure that Iran would not be a spoiler of this peace agreement. At first, when this message came to Washington, it was, in the words of some of the decision makers at the time, perplexing. Because 1992, suddenly the Israelis are referring to Iran as a global threat, as an existential threat to the Israelis. This argument was put forward by two people, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. Both of them deeply involved only 5 or 6 years earlier in the Iran-Contra scandal, in which they were trying to convince the United States to not only talk to Iran, but to sell arms to Iran and not pay attention to Iran's Islamic rhetoric because it was not reflective of the actual policy of the regime at the time. But Washington doesn't have a long memory. It didn't take too long for Washington to get over the somewhat absurd situation of this 180-degree shift from the Israelis. And part of the reason for that was because Washington was in the most powerful position it has ever been. This was the unipolar moment. It had the entire world. And though the Iranians were very eager to see if the United States would reciprocate some of the measures that Tehran had done, and were hoping to see after the defeat of Saddam Hussein that the United States would create a new order in the region that would include Iran. And at one point, Secretary of State Baker even stated that after the war there would be a need for a new security architecture in the Persian Gulf, including that of Iran. This was music to the ears of the decision makers in Tehran. They thought that they deserved this because during the war against Iraq, the United States did collaborate behind the scenes with Iranians, or actually the other way around. A secret channel was created between the United States and Iran for communication. The Iranians enabled the US to use Iranian airspace to attack Iraq. When Iraqi jets were fleeing to Iran, the Iranians did not return them to Saddam Hussein. And perhaps most importantly, when the Shiites in the south of Iraq rose up against Saddam Hussein's regime, which they had first been encouraged by the United States to do, the Iranians did not come to the aid of their brethren, and that helped evade a civil war in Iraq at that time, something that the Bush administration deeply, deeply appreciated. The Iranians thought that this was now their time, their moment, to get reciprocity from the United States, and that they would be included in the new region. Instead, you saw the United States moving in the opposite direction. Now, the new policy was going to be called dual containment. The new security architecture in the region was going to be based on not just Iraq's isolation, but also on Iran's isolation. Both states should be isolated. This was connected to the hip to the Oslo Treaty and the Oslo process, in which the United States' reasoning was that the more you isolate Iran, the more you will have peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And the more you have peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the more isolated the Iranians will become. These are direct quotes from Martin Indyk, who at the time was the brainchild behind this policy. And he told me that in retrospect they miscalculated because they did not realize that by that they created an incentive for the Iranians to turn against the peace process in order to undo the efforts to isolate Iran. And that's what you start seeing from 1993 and onwards. It's at that moment, not in 1979, that the Iranians starts to heavily support Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and throw resources at the Palestinians who were using violence against Israel in a way that did not happen throughout the entire 1980s. And the reason why they did so is because their calculation was that the weakest link in the Israeli-American strategic vision for the region to create a new order in the region based on Iran's isolation was the peace process. If the peace process was sabotaged, then none of the other strategic objectives of the United States in the region could be achieved. And at that point, that's when you see the Iranians, for the first time since the revolution, change what Khomeini had said and start becoming a frontline state against Israel, sponsoring these different groups, using terror and violence against the Israelis, and making and very deliberately positioning Iran as the opponent of the peace process. And this then continues throughout the 1990s and starts to reach a climax in the early 2000s. But it is not so that throughout that period, there weren't moments in which either side actually was trying to reach out to the other and see if they could break the strategic rivalry that had emerged between the two. Believe it or not, it was actually Netanyahu, when he won the elections in 1996, and he wanted to undo the peace process. He wanted to see if he could go back to the periphery alliance that existed between Iran and Israel up until the end of the 1980s. And he was sending out feelers to the Iranians and to see, are there any in Tehran who still view the region the way that the Shah did, or even at some point the revolutionaries did in the 1980s? He did not succeed. And then in 2003, there was probably the most extensive effort to be able to get rid of this rivalry that they had found themselves in. In early that year, before the invasion of Iraq, there was a conference in a European city funded by an American university in which about 300 or so folks from the entire region, including a lot of Israelis, show up usually once or twice a year. This specific time, though, they had some very unusual guests. The former head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards shows up at this and requests a meeting with the Americans and the Israelis at the conference, in which he gives a presentation arguing how a rapprochement between the United States and Iran can be manufactured, and that the Iranians realize, and this is why they wanted the Israelis to be in the room, that they would have to change their position on Israel in order to be able to mend fences with the United States. Since 1994, what had happened was that the US and Israel both began to undermine US policies in the region that they deemed beneficial to the other. So the US, the Iranians were sabotaging the peace process, the Israelis were doing everything they could to impose new sanctions on the Iranians in order to prevent the rapprochement between the US and Iran. And the Iranians had paid a heavy price for it, and they were trying to signal that. About a month and a half later, the ambassador to Switzerland in Iran conveys to the US State Department a peace proposal by the Iranians. He is the authoritative channel of communication between the United States and Iran, the channel that was established in 1991 before the invasion of Iraq, or expelling of Iraq out of Kuwait. And this proposal comes to the United States, and I think it shocked a lot of people there. In this proposal, the Iranians offer to conduct grand-scale negotiations, including almost every issue that had separated the two. And within that framework, they put on the agenda that the United States and Iran would talk about ending support for terror, primarily Al-Qaeda, that they would collaborate to make sure that Iraq would have a new government based on a non-sectarian government, same thing that the US and Iran actually had collaborated on in Afghanistan 18 months earlier, that they would end all support for Islamic Jihad and Hamas, that the Iranians would turn Hezbollah into a mere political organization, which essentially meant disarming Hezbollah, that they would open up the nuclear program for full transparency, and perhaps most surprisingly, that Iran would sign on to the Beirut Declaration, the Saudi peace plan, the idea that the entire Arab world would recognize Israel in return for an Israeli recognition of the Palestinian state. In return, the Iranians wanted a strategic dialogue with the United States. They wanted to have the sanctions lifted, and they wanted to have what they called respect for Iran's legitimate defense interests in the region. The proposal comes in. I saw it at the time because I worked in Congress, and the ambassador to Tehran visited with our office as well. In fact, I think the reason he did so is because he wanted to make sure that the President of the United States saw this proposal, which my former boss made sure that he did. An aide sent it over to the White House. Karl Rove saw it. He called back within 2 hours. He said that he found the proposal intriguing. He wanted to assure himself that this was authoritative, and since it came from the Swiss, that's the best indicator that it was something that was sent from the regime itself. And he promised to put it in front of the president. We didn't hear anything more about it for another 2 months or so, until there was an article in the Financial Times had said that some sort of a peace proposal had been sent by the Iranians to the United States through the Swiss, and the response of the Bush administration was to reprimand the Swiss ambassador for having delivered the peace proposal in the first place. The reason was that within the White House, a very limited conversation was held about what to do about this. And the winning argument was Dick Cheney's argument that was, we do not speak to evil. Whatever the United States could get out of negotiating with Tehran, the belief was even more could be achieved by simply removing the regime in Tehran. Remember, this is right after the Iraq War. There was quite a lot of confidence in Washington at the time, and the belief that after having taken out Taliban, Saddam Hussein, there were just a few other regimes in the region. If they also could be removed, the United States would be able to reshape the entire Middle East into its own liking. That, of course, only lasted for a couple of months. A couple of months later, by August, September of that year, you had the Sunni insurgency begin in Iraq, and suddenly the table started to turn. Iran's influence in the region began to grow as the United States became weaker and weaker in the region. Since then, we have seen this relationship between Iran and Israel continue to reach a climactic point. So far, there's not been any military confrontation. But what I think is so interesting in seeing all of this is that if you actually use ideology to explain why the shifts have been taking place, then you will have a very hard time explaining it, because all of the major shifts in the relationship between Iran and Israel have not coincided with any shifts of ideology in Tehran. They have shifted with the geopolitical context that the two sides found themselves in. In the 1980s, when Iran's ideological zeal was at its height, the relationship between Iran and Israel was actually quite different from what it is today, with elaborate collaboration behind the scenes, and the Israelis even pushing the United States to try to find a new relationship with Tehran. When Iran's ideological zeal was quickly waning in the 1990s, because the Islamic Republic had been an utter failure. It had failed to deliver any of its promises. It was a bankrupt state. The war had devastated it, and ideology was not going to bring out of that. And they had a much more pragmatic outlook. At that point, you see the relationship between the Israelis and the Iranians reach to the point of hostility, with the Iranians supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the manner that they continue to do till this day. Now, all of this may sound quite negative and sobering and sad, and it certainly is. But there is a certain silver lining in all of this. If this truly is an ideological conflict, then there is no other solution than a confrontation or a war at the end. Because ideological conflicts don't end in a draw. They end in a defeat of one and the victory of the other. If it, however, is a geopolitical strategic rivalry, which I believe that it is, then there are opportunities for compromise. There are opportunities for even win-win solutions. There are opportunities to be able to evade confrontation, even though, unfortunately, both sides, for their own domestic and regional policies and interests, have an interest in presenting and framing this confrontation, this conflict, as an ideological conflict. You have heard how some are saying that it's 1938 and Iran is Germany and Ahmadinejad is Hitler. And you have heard what the Iranians are saying about removing the cancerous tumor from the region, as is referring to Israel. The bottom line is, because they're trying to appeal to their own audiences. And in the case of the Islamic Republic, they're trying to appeal to the Arab states and increase and strengthen Iran's soft power in the Arab world. And in the case of, if they were to present their conflict with Israel as an Iranian nationalist struggle for power in the region, the appeal of that struggle would stop at the borders of Iran. But when they cast it in terms of standing up for Islam and defending the Palestinians, suddenly Iran's position has an attractiveness that goes throughout the Arab world, throughout the Muslim world. From the Israeli side, if they say that this conflict truly is about maintaining Israel's military hegemony in the region and its qualitative strategic edge, well, then it's Israel's problem. But if you define it as a Western liberal democracy's struggle against the theological fundamentalist state in the region, then suddenly the loyalties of other states, particularly in the West, more or less become automatic. I think it's critical to understand some of these points, because if we depart from the assumption that this truly is an ideological conflict, then we have also rendered a confrontation inevitable. Thank you so much.